The Waterloo Campaign was fought between the French Army of the North and two 7th Coalition armies, an Anglo-allied army and a Prussian army. Initially the French army was commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte, but he left for Paris after the French defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Command then rested on Marshals Soult and Grouchy, who were in turn replaced by Marshal Davout, who took command at the request of the French Provisional Government. The Anglo-allied army was commanded by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army by Prince Blücher. The war between France and the 7th Coalition came when the other European great powers refused to recognize Napoleon as Emperor of the French, upon his return from exile on the island of Elba, and declared war on him, rather than France, as they still saw Louis XVIII as the true leader of France. Rather than wait for the coalition to invade France, Napoleon decided to attack his enemies and hoped to defeat them in detail before they could launch the combined and coordinated invasion. He chose to launch his first attack against the two coalition armies cantoned in modern-day Belgium, then part of the Netherlands but until the year before part of the First French Empire. Hostilities started on the 15th of June when the French drove away the Prussian outposts and crossed the River Sambre at Charleroi, placing the forces between the cantonment areas of Wellington's army and Blücher's army to the east. On the 16th of June the French prevailed, with Marshal Ney commanding the left wing of the French army holding Wellington at the Battle of Quatre Bras and Napoleon defeating Blücher at the Battle of Lyonnais. On the 17th of June, Napoleon left Grouchy with the right wing of the French army to pursue the Prussians, while he took the reserves and command of the left wing of the army to pursue Wellington towards Brussels. On the night of the 17th of June the Anglo-allied army turned and prepared for battle on a gentle escarpment, about 1 mile south of the village of Waterloo. The next day the Battle of Waterloo proved to be the decisive battle of the campaign. The Anglo-allied army stood fast against repeated French attacks, until with the aid of several Prussian corps that arrived at the east side of the battlefield in the early evening, they managed to rout the French army. Grouchy, with the right wing of the army, engaged a Prussian rearguard at the simultaneous Battle of Waterloo, and although he won a tactical victory, his failure to prevent the Prussians marching to Waterloo meant that his actions contributed to the French defeat at Waterloo. The next day he left Waterloo and started a long retreat back to Paris. After the defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon chose not to remain with the army and attempt to rally it, but returned to Paris to try to secure political support for further action. This he failed to do and was forced to abdicate. The two coalition armies hotly pursued the French army to the gates of Paris, during which the French on occasion turned and fought some delaying actions, in which thousands of men were killed. Initially the remnants of the French left wing and the reserves that were routed at Waterloo were commanded by Marshal Soult, while Grouchy kept command of the right wing. However, on the 25th of June Soult was relieved of his command by the Provisional Government and was replaced by Grouchy, who in turn was placed under the command of Davout. When the French Provisional Government realized that the French army under Marshal Davout was unable to defend Paris, they authorized delegates to accept capitulation terms, which led to the Convention of St. Cloud, which ended hostilities between France and the armies of Blücher and Wellington. The two coalition armies entered Paris on the 7th of July. The next day Louis XVIII was restored to the French throne, and a week later, on the 15th of July, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS Bellerophon. Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he died in May 1821. Under the terms of the Peace Treaty of November 1815, coalition forces remained in northern France as an army of occupation under the command of the Duke of Wellington. Prelude. Napoleon returned from his exile on the island of Elba on 1 March 1815. King Louis XVIII fled Paris on 19 March, and Napoleon entered Paris the next day. Meanwhile, far from recognizing him as Emperor of the French, the great powers of Europe and their allies, who were assembled at the Congress of Vienna, declared Napoleon an outlaw, and with the signing of this declaration on 13 March 1815, so began the War of the Seventh Coalition. The hopes of peace that Napoleon had entertained were gone. War was now inevitable. A further treaty was ratified on 25 March in which each of the great European powers agreed to pledge 150,000 men for the coming conflict. Such a number was not possible for Great Britain, as her standing army was smaller than the three of her peers. Besides, her forces were scattered around the globe, with many units still in Canada, where the War of 1812 had recently ceased. With this in mind, she made up her numerical deficiencies by paying subsidies to the other powers and to the other states of Europe that would contribute contingents. Sometime after the Allies began mobilizing, it was agreed that the planned invasion of France was to commence on 1 July 1815. Much later than both Blücher and Wellington would have liked, as both their armies were ready in June, ahead of the Austrians and Russians. The latter were still some distance away. The advantage of this later invasion date was that it allowed all the invading coalition armies a chance to be ready at the same time. Thus they could deploy the combined numerically superior forces against Napoleon's smaller, thinly spread forces, thus ensuring his defeat and avoiding a possible defeat within the borders of France. Yet this postponed invasion date allowed Napoleon more time to strengthen his forces and defenses, which would make defeating him harder and more costly in lives, time and money. Napoleon now had to decide whether to fight a defensive or offensive campaign. Defense would entail repeating the 1814 campaign in France, but with much larger numbers of troops at his disposal. France's chief cities, Paris and Lyon, would be fortified, and two great French armies, the larger before Paris and the smaller before Lyon, would protect them. Frank tires would be encouraged, giving the coalition armies their own taste of guerrilla warfare. Napoleon chose to attack, which entailed a preemptive strike at his enemies before they were all fully assembled and able to cooperate, by destroying some of the major coalition armies. Napoleon believed he would then be able to bring the governments of the Seventh Coalition to the peace table to discuss results favorable to himself, namely peace for France with himself remaining in power as its head. If peace were rejected by the Allies despite any preemptive military success he might have achieved using the offensive military option available to him, then the war would continue and he could turn his attention to defeating the rest of the coalition armies. Napoleon's decision to attack in Belgium was supported by several considerations. First, he had learned that the British and Prussian armies were widely dispersed and might be defeated in detail. The other major coalition armies of Russia and Austria would not be able to reinforce the Prussians and British. This was because the Russian army was still moving across Europe and the Austrian army was still mobilizing. Also, the British troops in Belgium were largely second-line troops. Most of the veterans of the Peninsular War had been sent to America to fight the War of 1812. In addition, the Army of the United Netherlands was reinforcing the British. These Dutch troops were ill-equipped and inexperienced, and, politically, a French victory might trigger a pro-French revolution in French-speaking Belgium. Deployments. French forces during the 100 Days. Both the coalition nations and Napoleon mobilized for war. Upon resumption of the throne, Napoleon found that he was left with little by Louis XVIII. There were 56,000 soldiers, of which 46,000 were ready to campaign. By the end of May, the total armed forces available to Napoleon had reached 198,000, with 66,000 more in depots training but not yet ready for deployment. Napoleon placed some corps of his armed forces at various strategic locations as armies of observations. Napoleon split his forces into three main armies. First, he placed an army in the south near the Alps. This army was to stop Austrian advances in Italy. Second, there was an army on the French-Prussian border where he hoped to defeat any Prussians' attacks. Last, the Armée du Nord was placed on the border with the United Netherlands to defeat the British, Dutch and Prussian forces if they dared to attack. Lamarck led the small army of the West into La Vendée to quell a royalist insurrection in that region. By the end of May, Napoleon had formed l'Armée du Nord, which, led by himself, would participate in the Waterloo Campaign, and had deployed the corps of this army as follows: 1st Corps cantoned between Lille and Valenciennes, 2nd Corps cantoned between Valenciennes and Avesnes, 3rd Corps cantoned around Rocroi, 4th Corps cantoned at Metz, 6th Corps cantoned at Laon, 2, 3, and 4th Reserve Cavalry Corps cantoned at Guise. Imperial Guard at Paris. Coalition forces. In the early days of June 1815, Wellington and Blücher's forces were disposed as follows: Wellington's Anglo-allied army of 93,000 with headquarters at Brussels were cantoned. 1st Corps 30,200, headquarters Braine-le-Comte, disposed in the area Enghien-Genappe-Mons. 2nd Corps 27,300, headquarters Ath, distributed in the area Ath-Oudenarde-Ghent. Reserve cavalry 9,900, in the valley of the Dendre River, between Giraud-Augsburgen and Ninove. The reserve 25,500 lay around Brussels. The frontier in front of Loos-to-Binche was watched by Dutch light cavalry. Blücher's Prussian army of 116,000 men, with headquarters at Namur, was distributed as follows: 1st Corps 30,800, cantoned along the Sambre, headquarters Charleroi, and covering the area Fontaine-l'Arvec-Fleurus-Moustier. 2nd Corps 31,000, headquarters at Namur, lay in the area Namur-Hanotouy. 3rd Corps 23,900, in the bend of the river Meuse, headquarters Ciney, and disposed in the area Dinan-Ouy-Ciney. 4th Corps 30,300, with headquarters at Liege and cantoned around it. The frontier in front of Binche, Charleroi and Dinan was watched by the Prussian outposts. Thus the coalition front extended for nearly 90 miles across what is now Belgium, and the mean depth of the cantonments was 30 miles. To concentrate the whole army on either flank would take 6 days, and on the common centre around Charleroi, 3 days. Start of hostilities. Napoleon moved the 128,000-strong army of the north up to the Belgian frontier. The left wing was under the command of Marshal Ney, and the right wing was under Marshal Grouchy. Napoleon was in direct command of the reserve. During the initial advance, all three elements remained close enough to support each other. Napoleon crossed the frontier at Thuin near Charleroi on 15 June 1815. The French drove in coalition outposts and secured Napoleon's favored central position at the junction between Wellington's army to his northwest, and Blücher's Prussians to his northeast. Wellington had expected Napoleon to try to envelop the coalition armies by moving through Mons and to the west of Brussels. Wellington feared that such a move would cut his communications with the ports he relied on for supply. Napoleon encouraged this view with misinformation. Wellington did not hear of the capture of Charleroi until 3 p.m. because a message from Wellington's intelligence chief, Cahuin Grant, was delayed by General Dornberg. Confirmation swiftly followed in another message from the Prince of Orange. Wellington ordered his army to concentrate around the divisional headquarters, but was still unsure whether the attack in Charleroi was a feint and the main assault would come through Mons. Wellington only determined Napoleon's intentions with certainty in the evening, and his orders for his army to muster near Nivelles and Quatre-Bras were sent out just before midnight. The Prussian General Staff seemed to have divined the French army's intent rather more accurately. The Prussians were not taken unawares. General Z then noted the number of campfires as early as the 13th of June, and Blücher began to concentrate his forces. Napoleon considered the Prussians the greater threat and so moved against them first with the right wing of the Army of the North and the reserves. Graf von Zieten's 1st Corps rearguard action on the 15th of June held up Napoleon's advance, giving Blücher the opportunity to concentrate his forces in the rear position, which had been selected earlier for its good defensive attributes. Napoleon sent Marshal Ney in charge of the French left wing to secure the crossroads of Quatre-Bras, towards which Wellington was hastily gathering his dispersed army. NEY's scouts reached Quatre-Bras that evening, the 16th of June. Quatre-Bras Ney, advancing on the 16th of June, found Quatre-Bras lightly held by Dutch troops of Wellington's army, but despite outnumbering the Allies heavily throughout the day, he fought a cautious and desultory battle which failed to capture the crossroads. By the middle of the afternoon, Wellington had taken personal command of the Anglo-allied forces at Quatre-Bras. The position was reinforced steadily throughout the day as Anglo-allied troops converged on the crossroads. The battle ended in a tactical draw. Later, the Allies ceded the field at Quatre-Bras in order to consolidate their forces on more favorable ground to the north along the road to Brussels as a prelude to the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon, meanwhile, used the right wing of his army and the reserve to defeat the Prussians, under the command of General Blücher, at the Battle of Ligny on the same day. The Prussian centre gave way under heavy French attack, but the flanks held their ground. Several heavy Prussian cavalry charges proved enough to discourage French pursuit, and indeed they would not pursue the Prussians until the morning of the 18th of June. D'Erlon's 1st Corps wandered between both battles, contributing to neither Quatre-Bras nor to Ligny. Napoleon wrote to Ney warning him that allowing Dillon to wander so far away had crippled his attacks on Quatre-Bras, but made no move to recall Dillon when he could easily have done so. The tone of his orders shows that he believed he had things well in hand at Ligny without assistance.